A little after midnight on the 25th of October 1942, on a muddy ridge on the island of Guadalcanal, roughly 3,000 Japanese soldiers rose out of the darkness and charged straight at the thin line of United States Marines guarding the airfield, and at the very center of the sector they hit was one sergeant and his machine guns. His name was John Basilone. For the next several hours, in the rain and the dark, that one man would move up and down his stretch of the line, firing gun after gun, dragging weapons into place, running for ammunition through ground crawling with the enemy, and simply refusing to let his piece of the line break. By the time the sun came up, the Japanese regiment that charged his guns had been all but destroyed in front of them, and John Basilone was one of only 3 men in his group still alive to see it. Think about what the attacking Japanese were charging into. They had numbers on their side, thousands of men against a scattered handful of Marines, and they came in waves through the darkness, screaming, throwing themselves at and over the barbed wire, some of them using the bodies of the fallen as bridges to cross it. By every calculation, that thin, exhausted, malaria-ridden Marine line should have broken. And in the middle of it, the thing that would not break was a machine gun position run by a stocky sergeant from New Jersey who seemed, that night, to be everywhere at once. Whatever the Japanese soldiers charging Henderson Field expected to find, it was not this. A wall of continuous, accurate, relentless fire that no amount of courage or numbers could get through, poured out by one man who would not stop feeding and firing his guns. He did it by doing everything at once. Basilone was in charge of 2 sections of heavy machine guns, about 16 men and 4 guns, spread along a critical stretch of the perimeter, and as the assault crashed in, those positions began to be overwhelmed. When one of his gun sections was knocked out, its crews killed or wounded, leaving only 2 men able to fight, most leaders would have pulled back. Basilone did the opposite. He physically moved guns to where the danger was greatest. He fixed jammed weapons in the dark by feel. He manned the guns himself when there was no one left to man them, firing until the barrels glowed. He moved constantly between the positions, so that to the enemy the line seemed fully manned, when in truth it was being held by a mere skeleton of Marines and one sergeant who would not quit. And then the guns began to run dry. In the middle of that firefight, with the enemy pressing and his ammunition nearly gone, Basilone did something close to suicidal. He left the relative cover of his position and ran, alone, back through ground that was crawling with Japanese infiltrators, to bring up more belts of ammunition, and then ran back with it to feed his guns. He did it because without ammunition the guns were useless, and without the guns the line was gone, and without the line, Henderson Field, the whole reason the Marines were bleeding on that island, could fall. So a man ran through the enemy in the dark with his arms full of ammunition, because the alternative was losing everything. That is the kind of night it was on Basilone's stretch of the line. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like, and stay with us all the way to the end. It held until dawn. Hour after hour, through the worst of the night, Basilone and the last handful of men with him kept the guns firing and the line intact, breaking wave after wave of the Japanese assault against that stretch of the perimeter. When morning finally came, the ground in front of his position told the story of the night in the plainest possible terms. The great frontal assault by the Sendai Regiment had spent itself and been shattered, and the line had held. The cost to Basilone's own group had been terrible. Of the Marines who had manned those guns with him, he was one of only 3 still able to fight. But Henderson Field was safe, the perimeter was intact, and the Japanese attempt to retake Guadalcanal in that sector had failed, stopped, in significant part, by one sergeant and his machine guns. What John Basilone did that night was recognized with the nation's highest honor. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, and in receiving it, he became the first enlisted Marine to earn the Medal of Honor in the Second World War. His citation describes him fighting valiantly to check a savage and determined assault, holding his position when his guns were being blasted by grenades and mortar fire, and his sections were being overrun. It was, by any measure, one of the defining individual stands of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. But here is the first sign of the kind of man Basilone was. When people praised him for the medal, he is remembered to have deflected it, saying that only part of it belonged to him, that pieces of it belonged to the boys who were still back on Guadalcanal. Even at the moment of his greatest recognition, his mind was on the other men, and fame came for him, fast and enormous. The story of the machine gunner who had held the line at Guadalcanal was exactly the kind of story a nation at war desperately wanted, and John Basilone became a household name almost overnight. He was pulled out of the Pacific and sent home, back to the United States, to his hometown of Raritan, New Jersey, which threw him a hero's welcome, and then out onto the road on a nationwide war bond tour. He was paraded before enormous crowds. His face was in the newspapers and the newsreels. Celebrities wanted to be photographed with him. For a working-class kid from New Jersey, it was a staggering transformation from an anonymous sergeant in the mud of a Pacific island to one of the most famous soldiers in America, safe, celebrated, and comfortable at home, with the war an ocean away. And he could have stayed there. That is the thing to understand about what comes next. John Basilone had done more than his share. He had held on against a regiment, earned the highest honor his country could give, and been guaranteed, in effect, a safe and honored life for the rest of the war, training recruits, selling bonds, being a hero far from any battlefield. Almost anyone would have taken it. Almost anyone would have been right to take it. But John Basilone found, to his own surprise and everyone else's, that he could not. And the decision he made to give up the safety he had earned in blood and go back to the war is what turns his story from a great combat record into something harder to look away from. He asked to go back to the war. Again and again, John Basilone requested to be returned to the fleet, to a combat unit, to the fighting, and again he was refused, because he was worth far more to the war effort at home as a living symbol than as one more sergeant on one more island. He was offered a commission, a promotion to officer, which he turned down because it would have kept him from the men and the guns. He is remembered to have explained his refusal of the safe path in the simplest possible terms. He belonged back with his outfit, not with the crowds and the cameras, with his Marines. To a man like Basilone, the fame that millions would have envied felt like being kept away from the only place he thought he ought to be. Before we follow him back to the Pacific, if this is the kind of history you want kept alive, the choice is behind the medals. Subscribe, because that is exactly what this channel is for. In the middle of all this, at Camp Pendleton in California, where he had finally been sent to help train Marines for the coming island invasions, something good happened to John Basilone. He met a fellow Marine, Sergeant Lena Riggi, of the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, and he fell in love. They were married in July of 1944, and they honeymooned briefly before the war pulled them apart. Because even now, married, famous, and safe, Basilone had not stopped asking to go back. And at last, the Marine Corps relented and granted his request. He was assigned to a new unit training for a new invasion, and in December of 1944 he shipped out again for the Pacific. It is worth sitting with the weight of that decision for a moment. John Basilone was not a naive young man who did not understand what he was going back to. He, more than almost anyone, knew exactly what a Pacific island invasion meant. The beaches, the fire, the odds. He had already survived one of the worst nights of the entire Pacific War. He had a new wife. He had a nation that wanted nothing more than to keep him alive and smiling on a stage. And he looked at all of that, and he chose the beach instead, because he believed his experience could keep younger Marines alive, and because he could not, in conscience, stay safe while other men did the job he knew how to do. That is not recklessness. It is something much rarer and harder to name, and it would carry him to a black volcanic beach on an island called Iwo Jima. The invasion John Basilone had insisted on being part of was one of the most terrible battles in the history of the United States Marine Corps. Iwo Jima was a small volcanic island close to Japan itself, defended by more than 20,000 Japanese troops dug deep into tunnels and bunkers, and the fight for it would produce nearly 26,000 American casualties. On the 19th of February, 1945, the Marines went ashore, and Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone went in with the first waves onto a stretch of black sand called Red Beach. He had been a Marine for years, a hero for 2, a husband for 7 months. He had 1 day left, and he spent it exactly the way the rest of his life had promised he would. The landing on Iwo Jima was a killing ground. The black volcanic sand was soft and steep, bogging down men and vehicles, and the Japanese held their fire until the beaches were crowded, and then opened up with a storm of artillery, mortars, and machine guns from positions the Marines could barely even see. Men were pinned down and dying all along Red Beach, unable to move forward, unable to go back. And into that paralysis went Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, doing once again what he had done on Guadalcanal, refusing to let his piece of the battle freeze. In the forefront of the assault, he got his section moving, pushing, torn his Marines forward off the deadly open sand toward us, leading by the simple, terrifying method of going first himself. Then he went after the guns that were killing his men. One of the positions holding up the advance was a heavily fortified Japanese blockhouse, a reinforced strongpoint that ordinary fire could not touch. Basilone, according to his Navy Cross citation, worked his way forward and single-handedly destroyed it, moving in close and taking it out so his Marines could advance. And he was not finished. With the beach exit still under fire, he made his way to a Marine tank that had become bogged down and trapped in a minefield under heavy enemy fire, and he guided that tank safely out through the mines and the fire, on foot, exposed, so that its guns could get into the fight. Time and again in those first hours on Iwo Jima, John Basilone was exactly where the danger was worst, doing exactly what needed doing to get his Marines off that beach alive. He did not make it. Sometime in those first hours of the first day on Iwo Jima, as he moved forward with his Marines, John Basilone was struck by enemy fire and killed. He was 28 years old, the hero of Guadalcanal, the man who had held a line against a regiment and then refused every safe path the world offered him, died on a volcanic beach far from home, on the first day of the last great battle he would ever see, doing precisely what he had gone back to do, which was to lead his men through the worst of it. Because of what he and others did in those first hours, the Marines got up off Red Beach and into the fight for the island. He had spent his one remaining day exactly as he had spent his whole life, as a Marine, at the front for his men. And that raises the question that a story like this always leaves behind. Who was he? Who was the man who could hold a line against 3,000 attackers, be handed fame and safety on a plate, and hand it back so he could return to a beach that would kill him? He was not born a legend. Before Guadalcanal, before the Medal of Honor, before the crowds, John Basilone was an ordinary American kid with an unusual nickname and a restless streak, from a big family in a small New Jersey town. To understand the choices he made, we have to go back before the war made him a hero, to where he came from, and to how a boy from Raritan ended up with the name Manila John. This is the man underneath the medals. John Basilone was born in 1916, the sixth of 10 children in a large Italian-American family. His father had emigrated from Naples, and the family settled near the town of Raritan, New Jersey, where John grew up. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary, likable, restless working-class kid, not a scholar, not marked out for anything in particular, one of millions of young men in Depression-era America looking for a way forward, and like a lot of such young men, he found it in the military. But not, at first, in the Marines. Before he ever became Manila John Basilone of the Marine Corps, he had already been a soldier in an entirely different uniform, and that earliest service is where his famous nickname was born. Before the war, John Basilone joined the United States Army and served a 3-year hitch, including duty in the Philippines, stationed near Manila. He liked the army life and was a good soldier, and it was his time in the Philippines that gave him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life and beyond, Manila John. When his army enlistment ended, he came home for a while, but peacetime civilian life did not hold him, and as the world slid toward war, he enlisted again, this time in the United States Marine Corps in 1940. He had found, in the Marines, the outfit that fit him, and when the Marines went to war in the Pacific in 1942, Manila John Basilone and his machine guns went with them to a place almost no American had heard of before that summer, Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal mattered more than its size suggested. In August of 1942, the Marines had landed there and seized a half-built airfield, which they named Henderson Field, and whoever held that airfield could dominate the skies and sea lanes of the whole surrounding region. The Japanese wanted it back badly, and threw men and ships at retaking it for months in a long, brutal campaign of naval battles, air raids, disease, and desperate ground fighting. By late October 1942, the Japanese launched one of their largest efforts yet to break the Marine perimeter and retake Henderson Field, a series of massive night assaults over several days. And it was on the night of the 24th into the 25th of October, when that effort reached its screaming climax against the Lunga perimeter, that Sergeant John Basilone and his machine guns found themselves standing directly in its path. So hold the whole shape of it now. An ordinary kid from a big family in Raritan, New Jersey, who found himself first in the army in the Philippines and then in the Marines, and who was standing on a muddy ridge on Guadalcanal at the climax of a desperate campaign when 3,000 men charged his guns in the dark. Knowing where he came from makes what he became more striking, not less. There was nothing in the boy from Raritan that promised the Medal of Honor. What there was something that only revealed itself under fire. A total, almost stubborn refusal to let his men down, whatever it cost him. It cost him the safety he had earned. In the end, it cost him his life, and it earned him a place in history that almost no one else in the entire war would share. For his actions on Iwo Jima, leading his men off Red Beach, destroying the blockhouse, guiding the tank through the minefield before he was killed, John Basilone was awarded the Navy Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for combat valor, given to him after his death, and with it, he entered a category all his own. John Basilone became the only enlisted Marine in the entire Second World War to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. Think about what that means. The two highest awards for valor the Marine Corps and the Navy can bestow, earned by one man in two different battles nearly 2.5 years apart. The first for holding a line at Guadalcanal, the second for breaking off a beach at Iwo Jima. No other enlisted Marine of the war matched it. It is a distinction that exists because a famous man refused to stay safe. And back home, there was Lena. John Basilone had been married to Lena Riggi for barely 7 months, most of that time separated by the war when he was killed at Iwo Jima, and by the accounts that come down to us, she never saw him again after he shipped out, and she never remarried. She carried his name and his memory for the rest of her long life. At the end of 1945, it was Lena Basilone who was given the honor of christening a United States Navy destroyer named for her husband, the USS Basilone, smashing the bottle across the bow of a warship that carried the name of the sergeant she had married and lost. Decades later, the Navy would name a second ship for him. His body was brought home and laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, and his name lives on across the country, on roads, on schools, on that highway in California that makes drivers ask, who was Basilone? Gunnery Sergeant John, Manila John Basilone of Raritan, New Jersey, the kid from a big immigrant family who held a line against a Japanese regiment on Guadalcanal with his machine guns and would not let it break, who was handed fame and safety and gave them back because he belonged with his men, who married a fellow Marine and then shipped out to a beach he must have known might kill him, who led his Marines off the black sand of Iwo Jima and destroyed the guns that were killing them before he fell, was the only enlisted Marine of the entire war to earn both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. He was 28 years old. Somewhere, the descendants of the Marines he saved at Henderson Field and of the Marines he got off Red Beach are alive today because Manila John would not stay home. There is a question at the center of John Basilone's life that most of us are lucky enough never to have to answer. He had already done enough. He had earned the right to live. The country was begging him to take it. And he decided, freely and clearly, that the safety of the men still fighting mattered more than his own, and he walked back into the fire and did not come out. We tend to think of heroism as a single desperate moment. Basilone's was a moment on Guadalcanal, but his real heroism was a choice, made calmly, at home, in safety, with everything to lose, the choice to go back. That is the part that his medals can never quite capture, and the part most worth remembering. Manila John Basilone gave up everything he had earned and went back to the war for his fellow Marines. And every day, people drive down a highway named for him and ask, who was Basilone? Now you know. And that is exactly why places like this comment section matter. If your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather fought on Guadalcanal, or landed at Iwo Jima, or served in the Marines anywhere in the Pacific, or came home from any war and rarely spoke of it, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them, one thing they did, or said, or that you remember. The ones who went back deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.